Okay, so let's start this. Today we're going to talk about cluster analysis, and then next time we'll talk a little more about that as well. So basically, why do you want to use cluster analysis? It's sort of similar to a little bit, hopefully I'll add a little bit of knowledge to this, what you already learned from Steve Skinner in his data science course. And so basically you want to use it when you want to reduce the data, you want to find the cluster center shapes and statistics, or if you want to do segmentation of some sort, collaborative filtering, or when you do social network analysis, find similar groups of friends, communities, or just as a pre-processing step for classification and outlier detection or for sampling, data reduction. This basically you just need the clusters to move on to something else, a bit more exciting. So you also want to select attributes, like if you have thousands of attributes, you want to find out which ones are more relevant, which ones are not. Talk about this too. And for example, one good technique to figure out what the true most important attributes are. One of them we learned a while ago about when you do PCA, you find the loadings of the PCA, and then you find the attributes using those loadings. Another technique that I want to show you is about using histograms of distance functions. So basically what this is here, up here is like a two-dimensional distribution, like of uniform data, and on the right is like there's two clusters. And if you compute the pairwise distances between each point and make a histogram out of it, so this basically is the histogram, how many, you bin those distances, how many points have a certain distance, right? So here you see like what's just one distribution, because all distances are almost equally likely, because some points are close, some point pairs are very far away. So essentially, this sort of forms this sort of one single distribution. But if you have clusters of points, then you'll basically get two sort of lobes like this. So there's like some points, there's a bunch of points that have very small distances. These are the points within the clusters. And then there are these larger distances are these points that are, basically one point from here, from one cluster to another point in another cluster. They have larger distances. And sort of these middle distances don't exist because it's either far away or close. No point is has like just a middle distance, right? Either it's close by or across the clusters. That's why you find these sort of, two lobes now. Characteristic histogram of when you have clusters. That is the characteristogram if you don't have any clusters. So, and you want to avoid these kind of distributions, right? Whenever you have two dimensions that create this type of, histogram, and then they're usually like this. And basically, you don't want to keep those attributes because they don't really help you at all in finding clusters. They don't help you. It's just a random noise, right? You don't want to keep them. While this one you want to keep. So let's talk a little bit about, entropy, or how you can measure a worthiness of an attribute. Okay, we use this concept of entropy. So the concept of entropy basically works. Entropy is defined like this. So this is comes from chemistry or material science. Basically, entropy measures the degree of free flow, like randomness of a molecule or an atom in a liquid or solid or gas. Like when it's solid, things cannot move at all. Right? You know exactly where things are. When it's liquid, it moves around a little bit. When it's gas, it moves around a lot. And that basically tells you, over temperature, entropy, basically, gas has a very high entropy because a molecule can be anywhere. So if you know what the position is, that's very interesting to know. But in a solid molecule is always the same place. Okay, so this basically defines this entropy. And this is basically underlying concept of information theory and statistics. That basically entropy is one, but when it's a uniform distribution, not predictable at all. And where basically it means when you know a position of a data point, it basically has a lot of information because you cannot predict it without knowing the position. But when you have an entropy of 0 for constant signal, right? When there's only one value, then basically it has zero. Knowing the value has zero information because it only can be that one value. It's not very surprising if someone told you that value, right? In a random distribution, it's very surprising when someone told it value because you wouldn't know otherwise. So it's high surprise. So it's basically entropy is basically measures the amount of surprise you get if someone tells you a value. Okay. So in mathematics, the way you tried it is like this. Basically, if you bin, like entropy means you have to bin things, right? You have to sort of put things into bins. Okay, you cannot do continuous data, so it's something you have. It has to be sort of like in bins. It has to be discretized into bins. And then you compute it like this. Your entropy is computed over entire distribution. So basically, this is equation Pi is the probability of bin I times the logarithm of this probability of bin I, and then 1 minus the probability of bin Pi minus log of 1 minus Pi. So this basically comes down to this distribution. If you have like a coin, that you flip, if the entropy of the coin is 0.5, the probability of either heads or tails come up is 0.5, then the entropy is 1 of this coin, right? It's very surprising. Every time you roll the coin, you don't know what's going to come up. Is it tails or heads? So this is like, if it's a perfectly randomized coin, idealized coin, entropy is going to be 1. But if the coin always comes up tails, no matter what you do, because it's heavy on the tails, then the entropy is 0. Likewise, if it always comes out with heads, entropy is 0, right? Because you can basically always predict what is going to happen next. Okay. So we can use this concept also to figure out which histogram is better to pick, right? So here is the histogram of this sort of clusterized distribution. Here is the histogram of the randomized position. So basically, the algorithm would be is the entropy is high here, entropy is lower here. The algorithm basically is where you start with all the attributes completely. Okay, you take your n-dimensional space, start with all the attributes, and then you compute the distance entropy. You basically compute the histogram of distances in this n-dimensional space, all the point pairs, make a histogram and figure out what it looks like. And then you take one attribute out, compute the histogram again, and then see which attribute makes this, like in the beginning you probably have something like this, which attribute when you remove it makes something like this. So there's basically a difference in entropies. Okay, you want to pick that variable which reduces the entropy the most. Okay, and then and then basically you keep doing this until you get more and more interesting histograms like that have like interesting sort of holes there, and then basically that is going to be a nice attribute collection of attributes that makes nice clusters. And this is like a top-down approach that keeps reducing the attributes and we try to make sure that there's a lot of information in what remains. It's a very nice sort of technique on attribute reduction, right? It's just based on information theory. So I thought I'd tell you this algorithm because it's I like it a lot. So another way to sort of figure out now clusters. So this was attribute reduction. Now you want to do point reduction or cluster reduction. In the beginning, basically when you have n points, you'll have n clusters, and now you can find what are the reduce those clusters into something less than n. So one way to do it is hierarchical clustering, where you basically you can do it bottom up or top down. So bottom up, you basically try to merge points that are very close together, and then form this what's called a dendrogram. So every time you merge 2 points together, you'll replace it with a single point, and make one of those forks, right? So there's like 2 points here and then 1 point here. Okay, and then you basically run it again to see which point pairs is now closest. It could be one that you generated up here, or it could be another one, an original point. No matter what you do, you always keep joining them and then add another fork to this dendrogram and keep moving up until you have only a single point, which is the root. Okay, so that's basically how you do this hierarchical clustering. You can also go from the top down, where you basically split things up. So you start with one point and then you keep splitting it up. Anytime you have like two distant points, you split them into separate ones and keep doing this from the top down. Okay, so it's like bottom up, top down, hierarchical clustering. Okay? So top down is called divisive and bottom up is agglomerative. Okay, basically there's nothing wrong with any of those. You know, idealized, they should come up with the same, although there's a little bit of randomization here. But anyway, so this is basically the concept how you come up with these hierarchical clusters. And what's nice about this, when you have these hierarchical clusters, you can basically control the number of clusters you'll have, right? Let's say if you have space for only 2 clusters to store, then you basically go here on this tree. You take this guy, and this is like basically 2 points. Let's say you have room for 5 clusters, then you maybe take this one, and this one, this one, and this one, right? Then you 1, 2, 3, 4, and maybe this one, you'll have 5. So basically, you can create a cut across the tree that will basically be the number of points that you can store. Okay, and if you can store more points, then you can go down, lower down in the tree. So it's a really nice way to sort of control the level of detail, and the height of the tree basically tells you how close the points were together, right? So these points were very close. As it goes further away, the points are further apart, and basically here they're very far apart. So this basically the height of the tree controls the distance that the points had, either the real points or the points that you computed from the merging. Okay, so it's a really nice way to sort of control the level of detail with a tree structure. Okay, so it's a really good way to sort of, you know, whatever you can store, whatever you can show, you can go in the tree and figure out what to show. Okay, so it's just by clustering it. So now there's different rules. So basically it's just the algorithm for this. This is agglomerative. This is basically where you merge it. You initialize the distance matrix, then pick pairs of clusters I and J using this M. Merge the clusters, then delete the rows and the columns that from I and J, create a new row, and update the entries of the new row and the columns for all the points inside, and then, you know, go back and then do this one more time. Every time, delete one pair of clusters, replace it by a single row, and they keep doing this. And this way, you'll basically create this sort of distance matrix. Then from this, you can also keep track of things and create this dendrogram. Okay. So there's different methods how to merge. Okay. So for now, I just told you to take the average, but so let's say you have 2 clusters already. Okay. Let's say you have these 2 clusters, and you want to figure out which 2 clusters are going to merge now. Okay. So the one way to do it is you compute the smallest distance between each cluster. So basically by basically finding the closest 2 points between the 2 clusters. That's shown on the left, called simple linkage. On the right is called complete linkage, where you find the furthest points in the clusters and then compute the distance for those. And then, depending what has the smallest distance, merge those 2 clusters. Okay, that's on the right-hand side. In the middle, there's the average linkage, where you basically compute the average point in each cluster and then find out the distance between each of these average points among all clusters and pick the smallest one, and then put that in the histogram, in the dendrogram. Okay, so here the single best linkage, minimum distance with all m times mj pairs of objects showing the closest pair. Complete worst case linkage is basically the maximum distance, and join those. And group average, find the average. Okay, so this is basically here. And each of them have there's also other ones, global centroid, variance minimization, something called Morse method. So these are basically different ways in which you can merge 2 clusters into one. Okay, just by looking at the members of the cluster here, figure out what the distance between the closest ones are. Here, find the distance between the average ones, find the distance between the furthest ones, and depending which cluster pair has the shortest distance, depending, you know, that you will merge those. Okay. So these have different advantages and disadvantages no matter what you use. There's no one that is better or worse. So let's compare them. Okay. So the centroid-based methods tend to merge large clusters. Okay. Basically, you know, because you always sort of find the average. It turns out to be it tends to merge the larger clusters together, because this sort of that they're sort of always far apart. Then the single linkage method is basically this one here. That is really nice because it can really join very interesting sort of shapes together, right? Because you always find the closest point in adjacent clusters, and it helps you really to figure out sort of these interesting sort of shapes. Okay, so this is a shape here, and there's another shape here, because it sort of tracks it, right? Nicely tracks it across space. So if you're looking for trends or interesting configuration of points, the single linkage method can really do this very nicely. Okay, k-means couldn't do this because k-means always tries to find these sort of, it uses the radius, right? The distance of, it tries to cluster things in spheres. And this one tries to cluster things in sort of these interesting sort of configurations. However, a problem with that is that sometimes there could be noise, some noisy point somewhere in between, and it will try to sort of basically leaks two different clusters together because there was a noise point here, tries to connect them together, right? So in the end, you'll sort of get these sort of shapes that may be interesting, but they're connected to other shapes that are interesting. So you never quite know where can you cut those linkages, right? So here it's easily cut because you can just figure out where the links are, but sometimes it's very complicated links. So, so noise, these sort of noisy points that are sort of between, that are really just noise. Either you remove the noisy points first, which is a problem by itself, or you be very nice about it. And so basically, this is the problem with these kind of single link problems, that they're very sensitive to noise. Okay, so this is the reality of life. Another one, I'll give you like a little algorithm that's a little better. We're going to talk about it in a second, called DBSCAN, and that tries to overcome that a little bit. And but for now, the complete worst case linkage method tends to create large spherical clusters with similar diameter. That's basically similar to k-means, right? It basically tries to break these sort of nicely shaped clusters into these disjoint clusters, right? That's basically what happens, okay, with these sort of large linkage methods. They tend to create create spherical clusters, or they try to break them up into clusters. Okay, that just can happen. That's the downside of this. Of course, they're less sensitive to noise, but on the other hand, they break up these shapes into base shapes, which is a downside. So they never really win here, right? Group average ones, they're sort of good because they'll robust to noise because they're using averaging. And the hierarchical methods, again, they're sensitive to a small number of mistakes made during the merging process. Like whenever you go in the hierarchy and you tend to merge two things together, but you shouldn't, then you cannot undo that anymore, right? So once you make a decision and move up the hierarchy, then that's basically it, right? All of a sudden you merge these two together, then basically this becomes now a level in the hierarchy upon which new things are merged, right? So there's also, there's always a down and the upside to it, right? So that's why visualization is good, right? If you show the user what you've come up with, what kind of mergers you have made and what kind of clusters you have formed, you visualize this, then the user can say, okay, please break these up into two, right? So a user can help and assist undoing these kind of erroneous linkages, right? So that's what's nice about visualization. If you show that to the user can break it up into two distinct clusters and everything is fine, So that's why visualization is very important for these things. And I'll show you lots of visualization methods, how to visualize this truthful way. Okay, so let's talk about one more algorithm that is very famous when it comes to clustering. I don't know if Steve Skinner in the data science course told you this, called DBSCAN. Database scan is actually quite old, from '96. I think it's the most highly cited density-based hierarchical clustering that's around, right? DBSCAN is pretty well known, okay? So I'll tell you how it works. So clusters are basically defined as density-connected sets. So what it tries to do, it tries to overcome these problems with these sort of these kind of noisy kind of things. It tries to overcome that. And it actually does okay with it, but still not quite okay. I tried it, multiple times, and it's sort of, it's still, it does a little better, but still has problems. So it's never, visualization is always needed. So here it goes, right? So it has these sort of definitions, okay? Called one is epsilon distance neighborhood criterion, which essentially says a point P and Q, 2 points P and Q, can only be, the distance of P and Q has to be less than epsilon to be in a group, where in a group n epsilon, right? To be included in that group, the point Q has to be less than epsilon away from the point P. Then the point Q belongs to the neighborhood, epsilon neighborhood of point P. Okay? So if you want to recruit point Q, it has to be less than epsilon away from P. Okay? Then the minimum number cluster membership is another thing. This is basically the magnitude of a epsilon neighborhood, right? An epsilon neighborhood of Q can only be an epsilon neighborhood if it has greater than min number of points. Where you can define that. Hang on a second. So basically it tries to overcome the problem with outliers, right? So a cluster is only there if it has more than min points. Okay. And then there's this notion of density connected and density reachable, okay, which is a very important concept in forming these clusters with DBSCAN. So basically a point P is directly density reachable from a point Q with respect to the epsilon min points criterion if the point is in a neighborhood, like the point is in Q's neighborhood. It can only be, it has to be in point Q's epsilon neighborhood. So it has to be distant from Q less than epsilon. And the epsilon neighborhood itself from Q has to be greater than min points. Only these two conditions can P be recruited to Q. Okay, this is called density reachable. Okay, and then there's also density connected, and then we also talk density reachable. Then we also talk about density connected in a second. So here's basically these cases. Okay, so this is border point P and the core point Q. Like P wants to be part of the distribution that Q is already in. So P is directly density reachable because Q is in the neighborhood greater than min points, and P itself is connected less than epsilon. Okay, so P is directly density reachable from Q, but Q is not directly density reachable from P because P is not in an epsilon neighborhood, right? Because it has only one point, right? It's actually an isolated point. So Q is not reachable from P, but P is reachable from Q. Okay, so it's not reverse reciprocal. And then another one, P is density reachable from Q because you can go from Q, you can go to this point here, and then this point is reachable. But Q is not density reachable from P because P is not in epsilon neighborhood. And this is the density connectedness, right? So here you go here. This is Q is density connected to P because this guy here is density reachable. Q is density reachable to this one, and then P is density reachable to him. Right? So basically they are now connected, density connected, okay? Because this is connected to him. Is it reachable from him because there's an epsilon. This is epsilon, then basically they're connected like this. And these kind of definitions are then used in this algorithm that DBSCAN has, right? So for a point to be in a cluster, it has to be density reachable and density connected, and only then a point can be in a cluster. That basically reduces the likelihood of an outlier to be connected, or too noisy, or two clusters be connected that are only connected by noise pixels, right? So this can't happen. So you create these very beautiful shapes that way, right? Like this is very nice. These points are outlying because they're not connected at all, right? So you basically DBSCAN. These are very nicely isolated, although there may be a noise point here, but it's nicely isolated. So you can get really nice sort of configuration. So it's a little better than worst case linkage or single linkage because it has a little bit of some safeguards with this connectedness. But still, it suffers. It still has some problems sometimes, but it is a little better than before. So DBSCAN is a pretty well-known algorithm because it can really create these very interesting shapes. Sometimes you do have sort of interesting configurations in space, like a trend line or some, it could be meaningful, right? If you like, track along and you want to make a decision left or right, depending on the value, there's basically, now you see there's actually a fourth point where you can go up or down depending on the value you have in a certain dimension, in a pair of dimensions, or in a set of dimensions, right? So basically, it gives you like interesting ways to sort of figure out what these objects are in high dimension space. It's only 2D, but it also generalizes, of course, to the n. So I just want to like show you this DBSCAN because it's a really famous algorithm, and it's really nicely visualized because once you have these groups, you can look at each of them separately because usually the groups are very low dimensional. Although the space is high dimensional, the groups themselves are typically low dimensional, so they're easily visualized by themselves. And so this way you can find out what they are, right? And you can really get very interesting sort of configuration out of this. The DBSCAN is a pretty good algorithm for clustering, a little more sophisticated than k-means because it can figure this out. So another one I want to show you is k-means, but it's probabilistic. Okay. So this is basically on the left. We'll see the original data that there were, like there was a blue cluster, and a red cluster, and a green cluster, and some outliers, which are in yellow. And if you use k-means clustering, you'll basically get this green cluster this red cluster becomes a little bit part of the green cluster, and this red cluster also becomes part of the blue cluster. This is really not really nicely separating these three different clusters, in the k-means sense. DBSCAN may find it, okay, but maybe not because it may connect the blue and the green. So let's talk a little bit about something that is more statistical. When you look at this blue cluster, you can quickly see that there is a much wider distribution, right? So the covariance matrix is probably going to has a much larger epsilons, sigmas than the red cluster and the green cluster, right? And you can capitalize on this, okay, by using this called expectation maximization clustering, which I'm going to show you next. So expectation maximization, you may have heard of this in the data science class or in probability class, but I'll repeat it. So it's basically the expectation maximization. So hang on a second. I just want to check something. I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back. Sorry. Okay, so basically what you want to learn is about this Mahalanobis distance. Remember, in data science, distances are very important, right? We learned about correlation distance, we learned about leading distance, Manhattan distance, and now we're going to learn about Mahalanobis distance, which is essentially a distance, a probabilistic distance. Basically, what it tells you is this point x, how far it probabilistically is from the center nu of this distribution. Like x wants to be part of this distribution, but we want to figure out how likely it is that it's part of this distribution. It depends, because this distribution is not circular or spherical, it's more like elliptical. So depending where x is around here, right, it is more likely or less likely, right? So here, it basically tells you where x lies on these probabilistic envelopes here, right? So this is like sigma, 1.5 sigma, 2 sigma away from the center, depending on the distribution. So this is called the Mahalanobis distance, right? Basically, it tells you probabilistic distance from the point nu, depending on the distribution envelope. Okay, so basically, this is how it's traced, right? So x minus nu transposed times the covariance matrix transposed and x minus nu, right? So basically, you form this vector product, matrix product, and then you'll compute this distance of it, right? So it depends on the covariance matrix of distribution and on the mean, okay? And you can easily compute this, and then basically you have this distance, and then you know how probable it is depending on the distribution of the point cloud. Okay, so you can compute that easily, right? I mean, you can just take the point cloud that you have, you can compute the covariance matrix from it, you can compute the nu just by just computing that from the matrix, right? And then and then you basically can compute that, and then you can compute any new point and figure out how likely it is to be part of this distribution based on that, right? So X and U are n-dimensional vectors, and S is this n by n covariance matrix, and the outcome is a single number, okay, which is the thing. So let's see how it's going to be used in this EM clustering, okay? So probabilistic clustering, what's the nice thing about it is basically a Gaussian mixture, okay? So basically a point can be part of two clusters at the same time. This point here is part of this cluster and part of this cluster. This point here is part of this cluster, this part of this cluster. This is more reality with the real world, right? Because sometimes, data points, for example, people are parts of two different, customer segments. It's possible, right? Or whatever, right? It's not, they never make a discrete decision, okay, you're part of this or part of this. Sometimes they're part of both. So this is a much nicer modeling of the real life than is the k-means. Okay, so basically so how do we compute this, right? You can see each of these clusters has like a probability distribution characterized by covariance matrix and by the mean. This is more spherical, this is more elliptical. So this going to have a covariance matrix that is probably most likely doesn't have any entries outside the diagonal. This one has lots of entries outside the diagonal, basically only this one too. So basically you want to figure out what these clusters are, okay? So you need this probabilistic algorithm that figures out basically which point. First it has to figure out the clusters themselves, right? Because you don't have them. This is after clustering, right? So first you have to figure out what the clusters actually are. So you want to maximize the likelihood of all the points to be in certain clusters, okay? So this basically have to compute everything at the same time. Like you want to maximize it and you want to compare it with your expect, right? So you run this expectation maximization algorithm. So there's like two steps to this, which are repetitive or iterative. Like you make an E step, expectation step, where you update the variables, and you make a maximization step where you update the hypothesis, doing this back and forth. So this is basically what it looks like, okay, in visualization, okay. So first you start off with k cluster centers, okay. Then you iterate between two steps. Okay, you have to find out what the k cluster centers are. So you can use the same technique that before, like you can use this elbow technique. Figure out what the k clusters actually, what k actually is. But let's assume we have like initialized k cluster centers, and then we will update the locations of these, of course. Then we iterate between two steps. The first step is the expectation step. Okay? Then we basically assign the points to those m clusters that are these, k or n clusters that are basically the classes, right? So basically, I want to compute this equation here. I want to compute the likelihood of a point di be part of the CK, okay, the CK, one of these M or K clusters, okay. So the way you do this is basically you compute the probability of DI to be of given CK, and this is nothing but the Mahalonobis distance that I showed you before, right? So just take the covariance matrix and the mean vector of this cluster K, and compute the Mahalonobis distance from that. And basically this becomes this value in here, and then this is divided by the points, by the distance for all the different clusters, right? This goes over all, and this is WK, this is omega k here, which is the probability of the class CK itself. Okay, now you basically also need to figure out how important actually is this class. Okay, how important is this class? And basically you figure out by computing the probability of DI in CK, do this for all the points, okay? And then, depending like how much probability of all these points are in this class, then the importance of the class climbs up, right? The more points are most probably fitting in this particular class that's defined by CK and the covariance matrix of K. then the more of them, there's the class is more important, and then this should get a higher weight, right? Then this should get a higher weight to be, this probability of DI to belong to this class should be a higher weight, okay? So this is basically the hallmark of the expectation step. So now every point has probability assigned to belong to each of the K classes, okay? And now you're going to do the maximization step. Now you're going to re-estimate what the means of these classes are, and you're also going to estimate what the new covariance matrices are, right? Because you have to update it, right? Because now you assign the points to different classes, you'll have to update what the means are, and you have to update what the shape of the classes are, and you do it like basically by this step, right? You basically new case, by the new case, you basically find out, you measure all the probabilities of each point, and you multiply it by the actual value, the actual coordinate of the points, di, right? And that will basically tell you what the new mean vector for this class is. And you do the same thing for the covariance matrix. That will update all these clusters. And then you keep, just like in k-means, you're going to estimate again you expect again, you compute the memberships again. You keep doing this until basically things are pretty stable. Okay? So here's a little bit of illustration in case this is a little bit too abstract. Okay, so here is basically this initial configuration. Okay, and these are the points that I have, right? These are the points that I have, and I want to find the cluster definitions. Okay, the probabilistic cluster definition. We're going to start out with 3 random means. Okay, and it looks like this. Then I keep iterating on it, defining the shapes of the clusters, defining the positions of the clusters, and eventually I find the nice envelopes that go really nicely with those clusters, right? So basically this is nice kind of way to define these clusters. This is just by expectation maximization and then using it. Okay, so this is also pretty good, not hard to compute. I don't know what Python probably has this, and what's nice about this, it's no longer k-means where you just have absolute memberships. Now these points can belong to different clusters. And these points always belong to a cluster, and you can actually quantify a little more how likely it is to belong to it, right? You can really nicely define outliers now. Before with k-means you didn't know, right? It either was in or out, but now you can just by probability, by the Mahalanobiis distance, you can figure out how outlier this point really is. And the same thing here, right? And here this point is even in 2 clusters. And you can compute how likely it is to belong to cluster 1 and 2. So this is a pretty nice way to sort of determine outlierness at the same time, figure out multiple cluster memberships. Just have to do a little more computations than before, but it may be worth it. Okay. So another algorithm that I want to show you is what's called a T-distributed stochastic neighborhood embedding, or T-SNE, which is a pretty recent algorithm. It's also probabilistic, but more sophisticated probabilistic than what I showed you. Okay, and you also can find this in Python, right? So basically, what it does, it'll basically find these sort of oftentimes somewhat dense clusters because it's really density sensitive. You get like these sort of interesting sort of blotches all the time. Which are and the way it works really, it basically figures out. It figures out how likely a point is a neighbor of another point. Okay, and this is captured by this equation here. Basically you figure out each point, I, you figure out if J belongs to I, and you figure out how dense I's distribution is and how far away J is from I in terms of probability. And the denser the distribution is, and the more sparse the distribution is around I, then J can be further apart and still belong to I. But the denser the distribution around I is, then J is more suspect. J has to be also closer to I. Otherwise, it's not going to be part of it. Right? So it's very density, and this is measured in high-dimensional space, and it's very density oriented, right? So things have to be really sort of close together, to be part of one cluster. And basically, the layout algorithm is based on this, right? So basically, it tries to optimize this sort of estimate, right? So whenever something is probability is high, then it's also going to be most probability of being laid out in 2-dimensional space is also high. Okay, and then you basically create these kind of things. So whenever these points here, whenever something's in a cluster, it's also going to be in a cluster in 2 dimensions. It tends to like sort of, stretch things close together, and then, that are close, and try to separate things more that are not so close. Okay, so it's not the perfect algorithm either, and I've seen it fail many times, but it also works quite often, so it's worth a try if you have to do it. And and here's like sort of, it works well for this, minced data set, which is essentially a collection of digits, hand-drawn digits. This is basically the likelihood of a zero. Now, some people draw it like this, some people draw the zero more like this. This basically estimated over 1,797 images, 8 by 8 images, how people drew a zero, and how people drew a 1, and how people drew a 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So it's pretty good for zip code. When someone writes a zip code on an envelope of a letter, then this is pretty nice to classify, figure out if this is a 0 or 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. Right? So basically, this is sort of the probability distribution of someone drawing a 0, 1, and 2, and 3. And then you can, this basically is a vector, right? Each of these is basically an 8 by 8, a 64 vector. And then this basically now creates a 64 dimensional space. And then you can cluster that depending on, each point is each of these zip codes, each of these numbers, like individualized is just the average. This is basically a point in high dimensional space. And then you want to cluster the zeros, the 1, the 2s, the 3s, and the 4s together. And actually this layout actually works quite nicely. I have a little bit of an animation of this. So now you can sort of see how this sort of stabilizes over time. So this is like T-SNE as it stabilizes over time. Okay, so this is basically how it does. But it's iterative, of course. Basically, it tries to sort of create this layout. Okay, so it works pretty nicely. These are the different digits. You can also see that the 3, some digits are closer because they're closer, like the 9 and the 8 is close. And the 2 and the 5 is close. The 3, I thought the 3 and the 5 is close. The 7 and the 5 is not close because people draw 7s and 5s pretty differently. It gives you a little bit of an idea like how close these are. So, I give this webpage if you want to learn more about it. It's kind of, there's a nice video where the inventor, Van Marken, actually explains it. It's an interesting algorithm, and I want to make you aware of it because it's really, people really use it a lot. Although it's not working all the time, so it's not going to be the hammer for every nail. But it's I want to make you aware of it because it comes up a lot, right? And then but it will not solve all your problems, but it does pretty good. Okay, so I still think k-means works the best, but because it's robust to everything. But if you want to get more detail, T-SNE sometimes works, sometimes it doesn't work when there's a lot of noise. It just depends, so you just have to try all of them and see, what gives you the best results. So I want to switch a little bit over to time series data, right? Oftentimes you have data that are like a long time. So for example, here, let's look at these crime data set. Okay, you have the states, California, Michigan. Michigan is actually twice. Okay, I don't know why. Tennessee, Missouri, Maryland, Alabama. And these are the types of crimes: burglary, larceny, theft, motor vehicle theft, arson, many more. And this is the occurrences, right? So basically in California, you get 2,616 burglaries, larceny thefts, motor vehicle, while in Michigan, you get much less larceny thefts, but quite many burglaries, right? So actually, Michigan has more burglaries than California, and also more larceny thefts. Very interesting. So don't move to Michigan. Okay, there's 2 issues. Don't move to Michigan. Okay, let's see. New York is not on it. Okay, so let's look at this. And then, of course, you may have this over time, right? You may have this over time. You may have like different years of this, right? 2015, 14, 13. And you want to like compare those different years, right? You want to sort of capture that, temporal kind of thing in it too. So essentially what you'll have is like you have two attributes, burglary and theft, and you have this over time. Okay? And each point essentially is a time series, right? So basically, each point here actually has a time coordinate to it, right? There were, license theft in California was 6,298 in 2017, or maybe only 5,000, so on in 2015, and so on, right? So each of them is basically a time series. So how do you deal with this, right? So that's what it looks like. So basically now you have two variables or more, and it's in a time series, which is basically like going into the third dimension. And so we want to somehow compare that, okay, over time. I told you we'll talk more about this in the future. Time is sort of an interesting variable by itself because you can always undo things in the variable space, but you can't go back in time. The time is sort of like a thing that there's ordering oftentimes too, right? That something can't occur before another thing. But they have to know about each other, right? So sometimes the communication is very long. So things for one thing to cause another thing in time have to wait for a long time or not. So this is just this very interesting dimension, right? Time. So let's talk about this, right? So basically what you want to do, right? So sometimes you want to compute, I don't know why I use Michigan. Remember, you want to compute, you want to compare Michigan with Tennessee, or you want to compare burglary and larceny. Okay, so the similarity of two states, or the similarity of two crimes. Okay, you want to compute that, but then there's still time there, right? You want to figure out how similar are burglary and larceny, and how similar is Michigan from California, right? You want to sort of figure this out. But now it's basically two constraints, right? There's also how similar are two crimes in a given state, right? Two crimes. Here at the beginning, you just compare the states across all the crimes, or here you compare the crimes across all the states. But here you're going to compare similarity of two crimes in a given state over time, right? So now you take these two and compare them, how they are similar over time. And here you compare two different states, how they're similar over time, right? So you always have two vectors, right? Here you have two vectors, here you have two vectors, here you have the two time vectors, and here you have the two time vectors. Remember, similarity always works well when you have two time vectors, right? Then you can sort of compare, you can do a dot product, or you can do relation, you can do some things like this, right? Or Euclidean distance, but you always have two vectors, two long series of numbers that you can compare. So here you have the vectors across the primes, here you have the vectors across the primes, and here you have the two vectors over time, and here you have the two vectors over time. Okay, so now you want to do some clustering, right? Because now you have these vectors, and you can do k-means on this, or whatever it is, and create some sort of visualization how they are. So basically, you can do the crimes, right? You can find which crimes are similar and which crimes are not, right? So this could be larceny, this could be auto theft, this could be murders, right? Or something like this. Then you can basically compare the different crimes, or or you can compare the states, how they act over time, right? So you can go Michigan and California are similar when it comes to the crimes, and Michigan and so on, right? You can cross to the states. You can figure out the crimes of different state. You can sort of figure out which crimes are similar in a given state, taking time series into account. Like you can basically now say over time, which crime has sort of a similar time behavior than which other crime. Or you can do the states for this, where you can compare you can take a state, you can compare two states for a given crime. Well, is California and Michigan similar in terms of murder? Like in 2017, there's more murders in both states, or less murders in 2014. Basically, each of these is sort of, you can do nice clustering, right, by doing. But can we get more inclusive? Can you sort of take things all together on a single thing, right? Cluster the crimes, but include the time series. Or cluster states, but include the time series. Okay, how can you do that? So one way to do this, basically, you want to capture more information about the time series when you compare two time points, the data points. Okay, so sort of compute the similarity of two crimes and sort of sum the time series similarities of each state, or compute the similarity of two states, but sum the time series similarities for each crime. Okay, so that sort of brings these things together, in one single vector. Okay, so here's like a argument for this. For a given pair of states ij, so this is the time series of their similarity distance TSA for a pair STSA for a pair of states. So basically, for a given pair of states ij, for each crime C, you compute the time series similarity. Basically, each crime C of these n crimes that you have, compute the time series similarity and sum it all up. And then basically, you have for each given pair of states, you basically you can compute how the crimes relate over time. Okay, now you basically got the time in it and still have a vector. You can do the same thing for the pair of crimes. You can do two crimes ij. For each state, compute that similarity. Then you basically have that similarity. Okay. So this way, you can take time into account, but still have sort of this vector of two states, or have this vector of two crimes, and then you can compute the crimes. So now it's a little more averaged over time, right? It's a little more time has an effect. So it's less sensitive to outliers in a certain year, right? So now you basically have taken this into account. Okay, and then you can basically compute the better way. Then you have time in it, cluster on crimes, or have time in it, cluster on states. But now it's time resolved, what it's called. It's called time resolved. Okay, so one thing that could happen with time is that the time series might not be aligned. One crime might cause another, and so this whole time, this sort of time dependence that I told you before, right? Like one crime, there may be for example, one crime could be I forget like what could be a cause. Like there could be someone steals from someone and then 5 days later he kills him, right? So there's like stealing and murdering is sort of related to it one way or another. Every time someone gets broken in, that person takes a revenge and kills them, right? So there's like, it's of course very contrived kind of thing, but that could happen, right? So that's how you get these sort of shifts in time, right? But what you can do is you can do something called a time warping, dynamic time warping to do this, right? You may also have a geospatial component, right? Maybe there's like you may want to compare two states, how close they are together, right? Want to see that, right? That's maybe Michigan and Ohio, right? They're Ohio and Wisconsin, Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio and Kentucky, right? They're close together. Things may be more related because they're close together. New York and New Jersey are close together, while New York and Virginia are not so close together. Maybe there's a little less dependency. So you want to like sort of include the geospatial component in your similarity calculations. Okay, so you can do this with a space for a curve. Let's talk about these two concepts. Okay, so here's the or you may want to just keep time instance as a separate entity. Okay, this may work too. You may want to discover that clusters are sensitive to time. So basically, you can take each year as a separate entity, right? And basically just generate crimes for every year, and then see and see how they have changed over time, right? So basically now you make the crime similarity for you basically cluster all the years in a single space, right? And all the crimes over the different years. So basically you have like if you have m crimes and n time steps, and then you get m times n data points, right? So 5 years, 10 crimes, 50 points, right? And you can sort of see murder is sort of similar over all the years, while burglary sort of deviates over the years, right? Becomes more similar to murder over in the later years or something. You can sort of get an interesting visualization how times change over years, how crimes change over years, or how states change over years. So what I'm telling you with this is basically you just have to figure out what you want to see, and you can just create these vectors from it, right? You want to put time into it. You can do this time resolved measure that I just showed you. If you want to keep time separately, you can cluster them separately and introduce them separately. So it's really whatever you want to do. So here's like this concept of how do you align the time series. Okay. So if you just don't do anything, align them, if you don't align them, basically this is like essentially time series A and time series B, and the distance is just basically one point minus the other point to some power, and then basically that computes the distance time series. Like take the 2 points, compare them, find the distance, take the value in time series A, time series B, take subtract them the value in time series A, time series B. Do this for all the time points, and then compute that distance, and then you basically have the distance of time series A and time series B. So here you figure out, okay, well, it's pretty well aligned. Okay, so here's a hump, there's a hump here, there's a hump here, there's a hump here. So there's 2 humps that are shared, 3 humps that are shared, and 2 humps that are not shared, right? So this basically determines the Euclidean distance. This seems like these 2 time series are pretty well aligned, but this hump here doesn't have a partner here. This one doesn't have a partner here. So, but how do you align them better, right? So like, how do you basically bring them back together a little bit more, right? So how do you basically relate this hump here to this hump here, right? There could be a causal relationship that this blue hump here causes the red hump, and this blue hump here causes the red hump, and so on, right? And here maybe the time shift has disappeared, right? It could be, right? So basically you basically align the left half of the blue time curve with the left half of the red time curve, but you don't have to need to align it to a right part, right? And you achieve this by this dynamic time warping procedure. It's actually was invented for genetics, and you try to align 2 chromosomes together, right? Like in this, where they try to come up with a human genome, they use this, right? To align these 2 sequences together. But you can also use it for regular signals, right? But to be cautious, of course, you could cause false time. But anyway, this is how you can align them, right? So now, if you align them, it's perfect match, right? So this A and B are perfectly matched now because you aligned them. So how do you work it? So there's 3 constraints you can't skip. So for every point here, you have to find a partner here. But it could be one point could map to many partners in either way, right? So this point here has many partners in the blue sequence, and this point here has many partners in the red sequence. So that's okay, right? And then there's a direct correspondence here. So this is okay. But you just can't skip anything, right? You cannot just skip a red point and move here. That you cannot do. But you can reuse. Okay? And you cannot jump, right? So this we can't do. And you can't go back in time either. Okay? The things can't fold over. Okay? So these are the 3 constraints. And then once you do this, you basically go from here to here, right? So basically where you go here, the green point maps to these 3, and then it starts to rise here, and this guy rises here, and this starts to rise here and rises here. They rise together, and then here this guy is flat for a while, and this guy has a sharp peak. Then basically these 3 guys will all map to him, and they go over like this. So now you basically warp them together, and then the distance function, of course, goes up a lot. And now they're actually aligned, right? You basically align these time sequence, and this takes into account the problem of alignment over time, right? That some sequence is similar, but there's just some time delay that can't be explained for some reason, right? So this one will align. So this is basically a dynamic programming problem. I'm not going to discuss how it works, but essentially, you basically create all these different neighborhood relations and then maximize that over there, right? And so where a straight curve would be perfect aligned, no alignment at all. Something's flat, then this point is reused for the other sequence. This is like nice, this basically shows here, right? So this green one is reused, then it's nicely aligned, then the blue one is reused, and it goes like this. So basically this is the sequence of the merging that goes with these 2 time sequences. Okay, so it's a dynamic programming problem that you can also solve it exhaustively, but it's more efficiently used. And so this is basically dynamic time warping. Warps the 2 sequences together and make them all aligned. Okay, so it's available in Python actually. Check that. So okay, So I told you also, how can you sort of linearize map locations? How can you sort of relate different geographical locations with one another? So you can basically, take the crimes in Colorado and make them connect them better to Oregon than to New York, right? So how do you sort of, it's like time basically, like time just now geographical distance, okay? So how can you do this? So essentially, you can first, you take your map, your states, or anything, if it's countries or whatever it is, or regions, whatever it is, you basically create this sort of grid map, okay? You make a grid map out of it, okay? This is the grid map. We're going to talk more about maps in another lecture, but basically you take this map, and what's nice about this, that each state basically has 4 boundaries. So in each state has 4 neighbors, like four connected neighbors, and also these 8 connected neighbors that are go on the right. So Rhode Island is connected to Pennsylvania, but only on the vertex, but it's directly connected to Connecticut. And only this. So you can compute that, and then you can create sort of a proximity of each state depending on how well it's connected and how far it is. Right, from Pennsylvania to Oregon, you need to hop over all these states. From Pennsylvania to Texas, you can compute now like a distance. You can go, here, Virginia, and then you have to go like this. Okay, so you can compute like a sort of a distance from these 2 states, and then you can sort of compute, a similarity matrix depending of 2, how they are aligned. Okay, so. And then you can linearize this with a space filling curve, right? So now you can basically create a linear order of these states using this encoding, okay? So basically you take this, the space filling curve basically tries to sort of stay local for a long time, and then basically locality is much better expressed than going like line by line, right? So Texas and New Mexico are very closely related, but if you do a sequential ordering, then you'll have to go all the way through to South Carolina and go back to Arizona, or you turn around. So it's actually very far apart if you sequentially order it. But if you order the space filling curve, you basically connect these things very nicely when they're like in close neighborhood in 2 dimensions. You can also, there's also a three-dimensional space filling curve or an n-dimensional space filling curve, right? It just goes in higher dimensions. I've written papers on this, how to do this. It's actually very nicely feasible. And so this is essentially a space filling curve. How the Hilbert curve, there's a piano curve, and there's other curves. And this is basically the way it works. Basically, you go left, you go right, up and left, then you jump over and do this. This just replicates. It's kind of like a fractal. Okay, you can just go. Each of these super cells is connected. This is the highest resolution. Then the low resolution is actually, if you partition each of these 4x4 cells, then they're actually connected again in the space filling way, on and so on. So everything is essentially, it's like a fractal kind of thing, right? It's self-similar on a different resolution. And this way, you can now compute an ordering of the states. And now you can compare them, right, in a fair way, right? So you can really by proximity, right? So you can basically now, look at them over proximity first, and then apply the algorithm that I showed you before that use the time. Or you can, that's what you can do, right? So now it's nicely, you can sort of nicely, compare them side by side and make. Okay, so got 10 more minutes. So let's talk a little bit about scatter plots. Okay, so this is basically, a scatter plot of 2 variables. Okay, then 2 variables at a time. But what if you have more than 2 variables? Then you create this scatter plot matrix. Now you have like 4 variables, and compute basically the relationship of each variable pair. This is just a transpose. And here, this cell here is like variable 1, this variable 1, the variable 2, 2, 3, 3. You can just compute a histogram. You can put the histogram in. It's like a nice use of the space, right? Otherwise, you get perfect correlation, right? You're going to use it. This is called a scatterplot matrix. But the downside of scatterplot matrix is that multivariate relationships are scattered across the time. So you really don't really know how is this variable related to this variable, two variables, how they're related to a third variable. Right now you really don't know that anymore. You really kind of sort of have to go across it. Okay, so this is where you come. This pie plot is very helpful, which is essentially, if you know principal component analysis, then you know also how to construct a pie plot. Okay, so basically the pie plot, the way it's constructed is you'll find the two dominant principal component axes. Okay, two dominant principal component axes, and make that the imaginary x and y axis. Make that the imaginary x and y axis. Your first principal component axis is your second one, and then you plot all the data points in this basis that is constructed by these vectors. So basically, you take the data points, you take the PCA vector 1, dot it with the data vector, and then PCA 2 dotted with the data vector. That will basically give you the xy coordinate in this space. This is the x coordinate, this is the y coordinate. And for the dimension axis, you just take the dimensions PCA, the dimensions value in the first PCA vector, and dimensions value in the second vector, and then you plot that vector, that dimension vector into it, right? So this is basically this x1 here had this value in the first PCA vector and this value in the second vector, and you plot it here. And so basically what this is now doing here is it kind of tells you the relation of the data points with respect to the dimensions itself, right? So you can create these kind of visualizations for three data vectors. There's a cluster here, and this is the exposed rock attribute. Here is another cluster here. This is the exposed soil attribute, and here is the soil moisture attribute. You can sort of see clusters, right? So this cluster is dominated by soil moisture. This cluster here, this pink purple cluster, is dominated by exposed rock, and this red cluster here is sort of in the middle of everything. Sort of it has low values in all of them. So you can sort of get it's better than a scatter plot matrix because you can sort of see the high dimensional relationships at the same time as they relate to the different variables. This is very nice. There's like another one like this. So this is basically a biplot. It does well. The one problem with that is so you're projecting n dimensions into 2 dimensions by this linear transformation called the PCA, analysis, right? So basically, you have these 2 significant PCA vectors, and you plot everything into it. You project everything into it linearly, right? This is a linear projection, right? This is linear projection. So this basically, remember what PCA does, it ignores all the variances along the PCA vectors that are not shown, right? So if there is a significant variance in a third PCA vector, then things may be plotted together, data points may be plotted together, but they may not be very similar, right? They're just similar in terms of these 2 PCA vectors, but which are not shown, but they may not be similar in the third one, right? So they look like, the same thing with these attribute vectors, right? It's like they may be similar as they're plotted here, but they may not be similar when it comes down in the third PCA dimension, right? So there's a little bit of ambiguity there. This basically leads to projection ambiguity, right? Those remote data points may project on a nearby plot location, and this basically could lead to errors, right? There may be, Chevette and Skylark may be very similar, but maybe not. Maybe they're very different cars, right? There's just shortcoming of this PCA and of these biplots, right? But it's very free. It does a good job when the PCA vectors are when there was only 2 PCA vectors, and you can do a scree plot to find out, and then biplots are not bad. But once there's like more than 2, then biplots are a little bit questionable to use. Okay, so anyway, so then that's where you want to use multidimensional scaling, and Ayush last time talked about it, and I just want to repeat it for quickly. I'm not saying that Ayush didn't do a good job. I just want to show you again. So basically, what MDS does, it preserves these relationships, similarity relationships, and basically, basically creates this adjacency matrix and try to optimize for that, right? So, find the distance matrix, and then iteratively compute a layout that is based on that, right? So here's like data matrix, and then, you know, you can do this for maps, for example, where you know the distances of each city, and then you do this MDS layout, and you actually find out, if you rotate it a little bit, you find out that it's really the truthful location of the United States, right? So this is really nice, you know, nicely sort of laid out, right? And so the way it works basically is you're gonna find the distance points have in high dimensions, and you find the distance that points will have in the low dimensional space and two-dimensional space, and you try to make these distances similar. Okay, you basically try to make sure that these distances are the same. And of course, there is no exact solution for this, because there's this, you know, if you could create such a beautiful layout in 2D that nicely represents the 3D, then you basically just have a hyper slice, right? Everything is like on a slice in n dimensions. That you just basically try to, you know, transform to become the slice in 2 dimensions. But that's usually not the case. There's always going to be an error, right? So basically, you iteratively lay out the points, and then you move them around until this criterion is minimized, okay, optimized, okay. So Dij minus Dij, so that this is the point distance they have in high dimensions, the point distance they have in low dimensions. Try to make that small, and then this is going to be a layout, right? So the way it works is you put this mass spring system. Every time, you know, you figure out if you basically lay them out, and then you figure out, okay, is this point too close or too far on this point? And if it's too far, then you make a little vector on it that moves it closer. And then if this point here is too far from this point, then you move this point from it. So basically create sort of a force on this point, depending on all the other points, and then you make the point move along this force vector. And you keep doing this for all the points over multiple iterations, and in the end you come up with a nice sort of layout. So here's like an example of it, an animation. So in the beginning I just lay them out like this, and these are the different distances I want to have, and then you just keep optimizing it, and then eventually it lays out like this. Okay, so it's like a spring force, and you basically find now these nice clusters and these outliers. You know, that's basically how it works, right? It's a mass spring system. Okay. There's different distance metrics you want to use. Euclidean distance really works good for data. Cosine distance works best for data. And then 1 minus correlation works best for attributes, because attributes are correlated with one another. Turns out to move quite well. And, you know, and then, you know, 1 minus correlation, if you take the absolute out, then the most correlated attributes will move closer. If the absolute is there, then it doesn't matter if it's positive or negative, right? So that's basically, you have that choice, right, to make. And then you can get some of these examples. It's a pretty nice algorithm, okay? And then I want you, basically in your lab assignment, I want you to compare what you get with PCA with the MDS, right? And then sort of see how they relate, what are the advantages and the disadvantages, right? What do they capture and what not? The problem here is, and you might have guessed, in MDS, you don't see the dimensions anymore, right? This is only points. You have lost you have lost basically, you know, what is these points, how they relate to the attributes, right? It's basically now you only see the clusters, but you know, you don't see the dimensions anymore. Okay, and I'll show you down the road, I'll show you an algorithm that can preserve both of it, and at the same time also uses this optimized layout, basically get the best of both worlds. Okay, so today we learned about MDS, which is a similarity-based layout, which groups clusters based on the similarity and not just like a linear projection. Learned about, you know, biplots that basically just use the PCA vectors and project that points in that space. Shows the data axis. We learned about time series clustering, how you want to do this, and you know, learned about dynamic time warping, and learned about separate clustering methods. So next time we'll talk a little bit more about categorical data that have categories. There's different different methods that apply to them, and we'll talk about them next, and then we'll, that's basically the stuff that you may know or may not know from data science course. And I repeat it now. Maybe hopefully there was some new elements to it. And I'll put this video online, okay, on YouTube. I'll put the YouTube link on the webpage, and okay. Hopefully this was helpful. Okay, then talk to you on next Tuesday. Sorry, I just couldn't make it to Storybook today. Hopefully this was okay for you. Okay, bye.